Commander Zektar of the Crothan Empire stood at the edge of the battlefield, his four arms gripping various weapons as he surveyed the devastation below. The mining colony of Kepler, 442b, burned in the distance, victim to the latest swarm incursion. His purple scales rippled with barely contained rage as he watched the insectoid invaders tear through another settlement. The Crothans were warriors, bred for combat across 1,000 generations. They stood 3 meters tall, possessed natural armor plating, and could regenerate from wounds that would kill most species. In the galactic community, they were respected and feared as the ultimate soldiers. No one hired Crothan mercenaries unless they wanted absolute victory. But today was different. Today, Zektar would fight alongside humans for the first time. He had heard the stories, of course. Every species had. Humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, barely 50 years since first contact. They were soft, fragile creatures with no natural weapons, no armor, no enhanced senses. Their bodies broke easily, and they required constant maintenance just to survive. Most species dismissed them as clever, but ultimately insignificant. The Crothan High Command had accepted this joint operation as a favor to the Galactic Council. The humans had insisted on participating in the defense of Kepler, 442b, claiming they had developed new tactics against the swarm. Zektar had laughed when he first heard it. What could these hairless mammals possibly teach the galaxy's greatest warriors? A transport shuttle descended through the smoke-filled atmosphere. Human reinforcements, finally. Zektar straightened to his full height, intending to intimidate these newcomers from the start. He would establish dominance immediately and relegate them to support roles where they couldn't interfere with real warriors. The shuttle door hissed open, and Zektar's first surprise came immediately. The humans emerged in perfect formation, their movements precise and coordinated despite their ungainly bipedal structure. Their leader, a female called Lieutenant Sarah Chun, approached without hesitation. She was tiny, barely reaching Zektar's lower chest, but she looked him directly in his primary eyes without flinching. "Commander Zektar," she said, offering what humans called a salute. "3rd Battalion, Earth Defense Forces, reporting for joint operations. We're ready to begin immediately." Zektar studied her, noting the scars on her exposed skin, the steady pulse visible at her throat, the way her eyes constantly scanned the environment even while addressing him. These were signs he recognized, though he hadn't expected to see them in humans. "Lieutenant Chun," he rumbled, his translator converting his growls into her language. "Your forces will take position behind my warriors. You will provide logistics support." Something flashed in her eyes. Not anger, exactly. Something else. "With respect, Commander, we didn't travel 40 light years to carry ammunition. My soldiers are here to fight. We've studied the swarm extensively. We can help." Zektar's neck spines extended, a sign of amusement among his people. The swarm has consumed entire systems. They adapt to every weapon, every tactic. What makes you think your primitive species can succeed where others have failed? Chun smiled, an expression that somehow made Zektar uncomfortable. "Because, Commander, we're very good at being afraid." Before he could process this bizarre statement, alarms shrieked across the compound. The swarm had found them. Through the ash-filled sky, Zektar saw them coming. Millions of them, a living wave of chitin and hunger that had devoured civilizations far older than humanity's. Battle positions. Zektar ruarit. His warriors responded instantly, forming defensive lines with practiced precision. To his surprise, the humans moved just as quickly, but their formation was entirely different. Where Crothans stood in solid walls of muscle and weapons, humans scattered into small units, taking cover behind rocks and debris. The first wave hit like a tsunami of teeth and claws. Zektar's pulse cannon roared, turning dozens of swarm drones to vapor with each shot. His warriors stood firm, their natural armor deflecting the lesser attacks while their weapons carved through the enemy ranks. This was Crothan warfare at its finest. Stand your ground, trust your strength, and break the enemy through superior firepower. Then he noticed the humans. They moved constantly, never staying in one position for more than a few seconds. Their weapons were smaller, quieter, but devastatingly precise. Where Crothan warriors targeted the massive enemies, humans picked specific targets. They seemed to know exactly where to shoot for maximum effect. But it was their communication that truly puzzled him. They never stopped talking to each other, calling out positions, warnings, observations. Crothans fought as individuals, each warrior a self-contained unit of destruction. Humans fought as if they shared a single nervous system. "Chin, what are your people doing?" Zektar demanded over the command channel. "Fighting scared, Commander," came the reply. "Just like we always do." A massive swarm warrior, twice the size of the drones, burst through their lines. These were the elite units, intelligent and adaptable. Zektar had seen one tear through an entire squad of Regelian guards. He turned to engage it, but stopped in shock at what he witnessed. 3 humans were already moving. They didn't charge like heroes. They looked terrified, their faces pale with fear, sweat streaming down their skin despite the environmental controls in their suits. But they moved with absolute purpose. One drew its attention with small arms fire, dancing away from its strikes. The second circled to its blind spot, attaching something to its carapace. The third was already pulling the first to safety as the explosive detonated, turning the warrior into scattered chunks. "Ow!" Zektar breathed. The battle raged for hours. The swarm kept coming, adapting to their tactics, as they always did. When pulse cannons proved effective, they evolved reflective shells. When the defenders used explosives, the swarm spread out to minimize damage. It was their greatest strength, infinite adaptability combined with infinite numbers. But the humans kept changing too. Every time the swarm adapted, the humans had a new tactic ready. It was as if they had prepared for every possible contingency. Zektar watched Chen coordinate her forces, noting how she kept reserves ready for each new threat. When the swarm developed immunity to their standard rounds, the humans switched to incendiary ammunition without missing a beat. When drone flyers appeared, human snipers were already in position with specialized weapons. "You anticipated this," Zektar said during a brief lull, approaching Chen's command post. She was reviewing tactical data, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. "We always assume everything will go wrong, Commander. Fear makes us creative. Fear makes you weak," Zektar corrected automatically, though the words felt hollow after what he'd witnessed. Chen looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his scales ripple. Not weakness, something far more dangerous. "Fear makes us prepared," she said. "We're terrified of the swarm. We're terrified of dying. We're terrified of failing. So we plan for everything. We train until our bodies break. We study every record of every battle. We imagine every possible way we could lose, and then we figure out how to prevent it." A proximity alarm screamed. The swarm had found a weakness in their perimeter, pouring through in massive numbers. Zektar roared orders, his warriors rushing to stem the breach. But there were too many, and they were adapting too quickly to Crothan weapons. "Pull back," Zektar ordered, hating the words even as he spoke them. Crothans never retreated, but mathematics didn't care about warrior pride. They were about to be overrun. "Negative, Commander." Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your position. Are you insane? We cannot. Trust us. Hold your position." Against every instinct, Zektar held. His warriors stood firm even as the swarm closed to point-blank range. Then, impossibly, the ground itself erupted. Explosions chain-reacted through the swarm ranks, precisely placed charges that turned their own numbers against them. The breach became a killing field. "When?" Zektar demanded. 3 hours ago," Chen replied. "We mined every possible breach point while you were focused on the main assault. Fear of being flanked makes us very thorough about perimeter security." The battle continued to rage, but something had changed. The Crothan warriors were beginning to adopt human tactics, using cover instead of relying solely on their natural armor. They began calling out warnings to each other, coordinating their fire. And when the swarm adapted, they looked to the humans for the next solution. As night fell, the swarm attacks finally began to slow. They had held, but at terrible cost. Zektar surveyed the battlefield, counting the dead. To his shock, human casualties were proportionally lower than his own warriors, despite their physical disadvantages. He found Chun treating wounded soldiers, both human and Crofin. Her hands were steady now, the shaking gone. She moved with the same precision she'd shown in battle, efficient and careful. "How do you do it?" Zektar asked quietly. "How do you function when you're afraid all the time?" Chun finished applying a battlefield dressing before answering. "We don't overcome fear, Commander. We use it. Fear keeps us sharp, makes us careful, forces us to think instead of just react. Every human soldier here is terrified, but we're terrified together, and we've trained together, and we trust each other to handle that fear." She stood, and despite the exhaustion clear in every line of her small frame, she looked unbreakable. "Your warriors are individually superior to us in every measurable way, but they fight without fear, which means they fight without imagination. The swarm adapts to strength. It doesn't know what to do with creatures that turn weakness into strategy." Zektar felt something shift in his understanding. For 1,000 generations, Krothans had built their entire culture on the elimination of fear. They were proud, powerful, and direct. But these humans had built something entirely different, a warfare philosophy based on accepting their limitations and compensating through cooperation and creativity. The proximity alarm screamed again. The swarm was massing for a final assault, larger than anything they'd faced yet. Zektar saw his warriors tense, ready to meet death with honor. "Commander," Chun said, checking her weapon with practiced efficiency. "Want to learn what humans consider real psychological warfare?" Despite himself, Zektar found his mandibles clicking in what might have been anticipation. "Show me." As the swarm approached, every human speaker system activated at once. But instead of battle cries or weapons fire, music flooded the battlefield. Strange, rhythmic sounds with heavy percussion that made no tactical sense. The humans began moving to it, checking weapons and equipment in time with the beat. "What is this?" Zektar demanded. "Psychological preparation," Chun explained. "Gets the adrenaline flowing, helps manage fear by giving our brains something else to process. Plus," she grinned, that unsettling expression again, "the swarm has no cultural reference for it. How do you adapt to something that doesn't make logical sense?" The final wave struck with the force of a stellar collision. But this time, Crothin and human fought side by side. Strength and cunning merged into something new. Zektar found himself adopting human tactics, using his superior strength not for direct assault, but for rapid repositioning. He watched humans use Crothin warriors as mobile cover, the two species compensating for each other's weaknesses. The battle raged through the night, beyond anything in Zektar's extensive combat experience. But something had fundamentally changed. The fear he felt, and yes, he could finally admit he felt it, didn't weaken him. It sharpened his senses, made him more aware of his surroundings, forced him to think 3 steps ahead instead of relying on brute force. When dawn finally broke, the swarm was in full retreat. For the first time in recorded history, they had been pushed back not through superior firepower or numbers, but through tactics they simply couldn't adapt to quickly enough. The combined human-Crothin force had created something new, something that transcended either species' individual capabilities. Zektar stood among the ruins, watching the surviving swarm flee toward the horizon. His armor was cracked, 3 of his 4 arms wounded, and he felt exhaustion in every fiber of his being. But he was alive, and more importantly, he understood something fundamental had changed. Chun approached, looking equally battered but undaunted. "Not bad for primitive mammals, Commander." "Not bad at all," Zektar admitted. He paused, considering his next words carefully. "That fear you spoke of, does it ever go away?" "Never," Chun said simply. "We just get better at using it. Fear of death makes us value life. Fear of loss makes us protect each other. Fear of failure makes us prepare for everything." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the same warrior spirit he'd always valued, just expressed differently. Your people are right that fear can be weakness, but we learn to make it our strength. Zektar extended his least damaged arm, and what he'd learned was a human gesture of respect. Chun gripped it without hesitation, her small hand barely wrapping around one of his fingers. The High Command will want a full report, Zektar said. They won't believe the humans saved a Crothan defensive position. Tell them the truth, Chun suggested. Tell them you discovered that the galaxy's greatest warriors aren't those who feel no fear, but those who feel it and fight anyway. As medical shuttles began arriving to evacuate the wounded, Zektar found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness. The humans hadn't just brought new tactics to the battlefield. They brought an entirely different philosophy of warfare, one that turned their every disadvantage into an unexpected asset. The real revelation was yet to come. This battle was just the beginning of what he would learn about humanity's relationship with fear and why it made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. 3 weeks after Kepler, 442b, Zektar found himself aboard the human dreadnought Persistence of Memory, studying tactical recordings with an intensity that would have shocked his fellow Crotons. The Joint Task Force had been formalized after their unexpected victory, and he'd been assigned as liaison to the human fleet. What he'd discovered in those weeks had fundamentally altered his understanding of warfare. The humans had given him full access to their military history, and what he found there defied all logic. They celebrated defeats as often as victories, studying failures with meticulous detail. Where Crothan history honored the mighty and forgot the fallen, humans built monuments to disasters and taught them in their academies. You want to understand human warfare? Admiral Reyes had told him on his first day. Start with our failures. That's where we learn to be dangerous. Now, floating in zero gravity in the observation deck, Zektar watched Earth through the viewport while reviewing something called the Black Death. Not a military campaign, but a plague that had killed millions of humans centuries ago. Yet they'd studied it, learned from it, and applied those lessons to combat scenarios. Disease had taught them about adaptation. Suffering had taught them about endurance. Fear had taught them about preparation. Fascinating reading. Lieutenant Chen's voice interrupted his thoughts. She floated up beside him, carrying 2 containers of what humans called coffee. She'd been assigned as his cultural liaison, a role that seemed to consist mainly of explaining why humans did things that made no sense. Your species memorializes catastrophes, Zektar observed, accepting the bitter liquid. He'd developed a taste for it, though it would probably kill most Crotons. Another human contradiction. They regularly consumed mild poisons for pleasure. We memorialize lessons, Chun corrected. The Black Death taught us about quarantine procedures. The World Wars taught us about industrial mobilization. The climate crisis taught us about long-term thinking. Every disaster is a teacher if you survive the class. A communication alert interrupted them. Priority 1. A swarm hive ship had been detected approaching the Tau Ceti colonies. Larger than anything previously recorded, it represented an extinction-level threat to the inhabitants. The Joint Task Force was being scrambled for immediate deployment. As they rushed to battle stations, Zektar noticed something that had become familiar over the past weeks. The humans weren't panicking, but they weren't calm either. They moved with controlled urgency, fear visible in their micro-expressions, but not controlling their actions. They double-checked equipment that had already been checked, ran diagnostics on systems that were functioning perfectly, and confirmed backup plans for backup plans. In the tactical briefing, Admiral Reyes displayed the hive ship's specifications. It was massive, the size of a small moon, with enough swarm drones to overwhelm entire systems. Crothan military doctrine would typically call for a massive frontal assault, bringing their most powerful weapons to bear in an attempt to crack it open before it could deploy its forces. We're not doing that, Reyes announced, as if reading Zektar's thoughts. Direct assault plays to their strengths. We need to make them play to ours. The human plan was insane. Instead of attacking, They would let the hive ship deploy its forces, stretching the swarm thin across multiple colonies. Small human units would harass and delay, trading space for time, while the main force prepared something they called a honey trap. "You're using colonies as bait," one of the Crofin warriors objected. "Billions of lives at risk." "Calculated risk," Reyes replied. Those Zektar could see the tension in her jaw. "We've already evacuated 70% of the population. The remaining volunteers understand what we're doing. They're afraid, but they're staying anyway." This was another thing Zektar had learned about humans. They didn't conquer fear, they negotiated with it. Those colonists were terrified, but they'd chosen to channel that terror into defiance. It was a form of courage Krothins had no word for. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Tau Ceti system. The hive ship was already there, a grotesque sphere of organic metal and living tissue. As predicted, it began disgorging swarms toward the inhabited worlds, confident in its overwhelming numbers. "All units, execute Broken Wing," Reyes commanded. Across the system, human ships began hidden, run attacks, firing just enough to be annoying before retreating. To Crofin eyes, it looked like cowardice. But Zektar had learned to see the pattern. Each retreat drew swarm forces further from the hive ship. Each feigned weakness pulled enemy units out of mutual support range. Persistence itself played the role of wounded prey, venting atmosphere and broadcasting distress signals after taking apparently critical hits. The swarm, sensing an easy kill on the human flagship, diverted massive forces to pursue. "They're taking the bait," Chen reported from her station. "Swarm forces are now spread across 18 million kilometers. Spring the trap," Reyes ordered. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The evacuated colonies suddenly came alive with weapons fire, automated defenses the humans had spent weeks installing. The damaged human ships dropped their disguises, revealing full combat readiness. And from the system's asteroid belt, 100 small craft emerged from sensor-blocking positions. But the real surprise was what those small craft carried. Not weapons, but modified mining equipment loaded with something humans called the recipe, a cocktail of pheromones and chemical signals they'd reverse-engineered from captured swarm specimens. "What does it do?" Zektar had asked during the planning. "Makes them homesick," a human scientist had explained with a grin. Now he watched the effect in real time. Swarm drones, suddenly bombarded with the chemical equivalent of a recall order, began turning back toward the hive ship. But they met others still following attack orders. Confusion spread through the swarm like a virus. Units began attacking each other, unable to reconcile conflicting imperatives. "Phase 2, Reyes commanded. The human fleet struck while the swarm was in chaos. But, again, not as Krothins would have. Instead of mass firepower, they used surgical strikes. Small teams and stealth ships penetrated the hive's confused defenses, planting charges at critical nodes identified through careful analysis of previous encounters. Zektar joined one of these teams, led by Chun. Flying a modified stealth courier through the swarm's disrupted formations was the most terrifying experience of his life. His every instinct screamed to fight, to unleash his weapons on the enemies surrounding them. But he followed the human's lead, staying silent and invisible while fear coursed through his system like acid. "You're doing great," Chun whispered over private comms, noticing his distress. "Use it. Fear, make your senses sharper. Trust it to keep you alive." They reached their target, a neural node the size of a city block, pulsing with the bioelectric signals that coordinated the hive ship's functions. While the tech team planted charges, Zektar stood guard with Chun and the other soldiers. The swarm was starting to adapt to the pheromone attack, some units overcoming the confusion. "Movement," one of the humans reported. "Warrior cast, Section 7. "I see them," Chun confirmed. "Johnson, Martinez, prepare fallback route. Zektar with me." They moved to intercept, and Zektar saw Chen's hands shaking again. But her aim was rock steady as she placed precision shots that herded the warriors away from the tech team. She wasn't trying to kill them, he realized, just buying time. "Why not eliminate them?" he asked. Dead swarm can't be confused, she replied. Wounded ones can still receive conflicting signals. Everything's psychological with us, Commander. Even our violence. The charges were set. They retreated through corridors that all looked identical, but the humans never hesitated. They'd memorized the route, prepared for every contingency, turned their fear of getting lost into obsessive preparation. As they cleared the hive ship, explosions began rippling through its structure. Not enough to destroy it. That would take more firepower than the entire fleet possessed, but enough to cripple its coordination systems, turning the hive ship from a unified organism into a collection of confused parts. Now comes the hard part, Reyes announced over the fleet channel. The hard part was another human innovation. Instead of trying to destroy the crippled hive ship, they were going to board it in force and attempt something unprecedented, reprogram it. That's impossible, Zektar stated flatly when he'd first heard the plan. Probably, the lead scientist had agreed cheerfully. But if we don't try, we'll never know. Failure's just data for the next attempt. The boarding operation was the most complex military action Zektar had ever witnessed. Thousands of soldiers, human and Crothan, inserted into a hostile organism the size of a moon. They fought through biological defenses, adapted to shifting internal geography, and pressed toward the central consciousness that controlled it all. Zektar found himself leading a mixed unit, applying everything he'd learned about human tactics. When they encountered a swarm ambush, instead of charging through with brute force, he had his unit fall back and gas the corridor with pheromone disruptors. When warriors adapted to their weapons, they switched to industrial mining lasers the humans had modified. When the hive ship tried to crush them by sealing corridors, they used explosive charges and patterns that created new routes. You're thinking like a human, Chen observed during a brief rest. Is that an insult or compliment? Zektar asked, checking his wounds. Minor by Crothan standards, they would have killed a human twice over. Highest compliment I can give, she said. You're using fear as a tool instead of fighting it. They reached the central consciousness after 18 hours of continuous combat. It was a massive organic computer, neurons the size of trees, pulsing with alien thought. The science team immediately went to work, attempting to interface human technology with swarm biology. It's fighting us, the lead scientist reported. The consciousness is adapting to our intrusion attempts. Then, give it something else to adapt to, Chun suggested. She turned to the soldiers. Everyone, random actions. No patterns. Make noise, move constantly, change positions. Give it so much sensory input, it can't focus on a hack. It was chaos. Soldiers fired weapons at random intervals, sang different songs, performed contradictory movements. Zektar found himself doing something he'd never imagined, dancing, badly, to human music while firing his plasma cannon at the ceiling. It was undignified, ridiculous, and absolutely effective. The swarm consciousness, evolved to adapt to patterns and tactics, couldn't process pure randomness. While it tried to make sense of the chaos, the human technicians slipped past its defenses. We're in, the scientist announced. Uploading new parameters now. What they uploaded wasn't a virus or a control program. It was something far more insidious, Stout. The humans introduced concepts the swarm had never encountered. Uncertainty, self-reflection, the fear of being wrong. They gave the hive ship the capacity to second-guess itself. The effect was immediate and devastating. The hive ship's actions became hesitant, confused. Instead of coordinating attacks, it began questioning its own decisions. Drones received orders, then contradictory orders, then queries about which orders to follow. Philosophical warfare, Chun explained as they watched the swarm tear itself apart with indecision. We gave it anxiety. Welcome to the human condition, you bastards. The evacuation was harrowing. The hive ship, in its confusion, was becoming increasingly unstable. Sections decompressed randomly, gravity fluctuated wildly, and the biological systems began consuming themselves. They lost soldiers on the way out, humans and Crothans both, fighting side by side to ensure others escaped. When the last shuttle cleared the hive ship, Zektar watched it die from the observation deck. Not an explosion or collapse, but in a kind of mechanical madness. It turned on itself, weapons systems firing inward, propulsion driving it in circles. The mighty organism that had consumed civilizations was reduced to a cosmic psychiatric patient, destroyed not by superior firepower, but by the introduction of human neuroses. "We'll study the wreckage," Admiral Reyes announced to the fleet. "Learn from it. Prepare for the next one. Because there will be a next one, and it will have adapted to this tactic. And you'll adapt faster," Zektar said. It wasn't a question anymore. He understood now why humans were dangerous. Not because they conquered fear, but because they'd made it their advisor. Every human strength came from acknowledging a weakness. They were mortal, so they recorded everything. They were fragile, so they worked together. They were afraid, so they prepared for everything. "We've gotten very good at adaptation," Reyes agreed. "We had to. When you're born without claws, armor, or acid blood, paranoia is a survival trait." In the debriefing that followed, Zektar found himself contributing to human tactical planning. He suggested ways Crothin's strength could complement human cunning, how their species' different approaches to fear could create new doctrines. The humans listened intently, taking notes, asking questions, turning his observations into potential strategies. "You've changed," Chen observed after the meeting. They stood in the observation lounge, watching repair crews work on damaged ships. "I've learned," Zektar corrected. "My people believe fear is weakness to be eliminated. But you show me it's simply another tool like strength or speed. The weakness is in not knowing how to use it. Fear's just your brain trying to keep you alive," Chen said. "The trick is teaching it to be helpful instead of harmful. Takes practice and a lot of failure. Your species seems to excel at both," Zektar noted, surprising himself with what humans called humor. Chen laughed, that strange barking sound humans made. "Tens of thousands of years of practice. We're either very stubborn or very stupid. Jury's still out on which." A new alert came through. 3 more hive ships detected, moving toward human space in formation. The swarm had indeed adapted, now traveling in groups to prevent isolation and confusion tactics. "Scared?" Chen asked, noting Zektar's expression. "Terrified," he admitted, feeling no shame in the word anymore. "But I'm also thinking about countermeasures. If they travel in groups, they must communicate. Communication can be intercepted, confused, turned against them. Now you're getting it," Chen approved. "Fear's not the enemy. Complacency is. As long as we're scared, we're thinking. As long as we're thinking, we're dangerous." As the fleet prepared for the next engagement, Zektar found himself truly understanding human military philosophy for the first time. They didn't win through superior firepower or technology. They won by accepting their limitations and turning them into advantages. They won by being more afraid of failure than death, and channeling that fear into relentless preparation. Most importantly, they won by teaching others their methods. The Crothin warriors were beginning to adopt human tactics, not replacing their strength, but augmenting it with cunning. Other species in the fleet were learning too, each finding their own balance between power and paranoia. The war with the swarm was far from over. But for the first time since it began, Zektar believed they could win. Not through might alone, but through the fusion of strength and fear, courage and creativity, Crothin power and human ingenuity. The galaxy's greatest warriors weren't those who felt no fear. They were those who felt it, acknowledged it, and used it to become something greater than either species could be alone. The war had raged for 2 years. 2 years since Zektar first fought alongside humans at Kepler 442b. 2 years of learning, adapting, and slowly pushing back the swarm. But today, standing on the bridge of the joint command vessel Unity's Paradox, he faced something that chilled him more than any battle. The swarm had learned from humans too. "They're using our tactics against us," Admiral Reyes said quietly, studying the tactical display. The latest swarm offensive showed disturbing new patterns. Hit and run attacks. feints, and misdirection. Psychological warfare. They'd even begun taking prisoners, something the old swarm would never have considered. "Ow?" General Thompson asked. The older human looked exhausted, deep lines etched into his face from 2 years of constant warfare. "We taught them," Chen said from her station. She'd been promoted to commander, leading the new Joint Species Special Operations Division. Every time we used fear as a weapon, they adapted. We showed them that strength alone doesn't win wars. Now they know it too. Zektar studied the data streams. Swarm forces were hitting supply lines, avoiding direct confrontation, spreading themselves thin to force the Alliance to defend everywhere at once. Classic human asymmetric warfare, executed by a species that had previously relied solely on overwhelming numbers. "There's something else," the intelligence officer reported. "We've intercepted communications between Hive ships. They're not just coordinating, they're debating, disagreeing, having what we can only describe as strategic arguments." The doubt virus, Chen breathed. It didn't just affect that one Hive ship. It spread. They're not a unified consciousness anymore. They're individuals. And individuals can learn fear. A priority message interrupted the discussion. It was from Scout Ship Resilience, patrolling the outer systems. The transmission was garbled, full of static, but the message was clear. They'd found the swarm's new base of operations. Not a Hive ship, but an actual planet, fortified and defended like nothing they'd seen before. "They've learned to build static defenses," Reyes observed. "No more wandering Hive ships we can isolate. They have a home now. Something to defend. Something to lose." The implications were staggering. A swarm that understood the concept of home would fight differently. Desperately. Like humans had always fought. "We need to see this," Zektar said. "Full reconnaissance before we plan anything." The journey to what they were calling Swarm Prime took 3 weeks through contested space. They traveled in stealth, using every trick humans and Krothans had developed together. What they found when they arrived defied every expectation. The planet wasn't just fortified, it was transformed. The swarm had built cities. Not the organic hives they'd always favored, but actual structures with purpose and planning. Defensive installations that borrowed from human design. Agricultural zones that suggested they'd learn to plan for the future instead of simply consuming everything in their path. "They're becoming us," Chen whispered, horror in her voice. "We didn't just teach them tactics. We taught them civilization. But it was the transmission they intercepted that truly changed everything. It came on human frequencies, in perfect, unaccented English, directed at their hidden position. Commanders of the Alliance fleet, the voice was unmistakably swarm, but with new inflections, new patterns. "I am Prime Thinker Zek-9. I speak for the evolved swarm. We know you are there. We learned to detect your stealth techniques 7 cycles ago. We do not attack because we wish to communicate." "It's a trap," one of the Krothan warriors growled. "Everything's a trap," Chen countered. "Question is whether it's one worth walking into." After heated debate, they agreed to respond. What followed was the most surreal experience of Zektar's life. A video conference with the species they'd been fighting for survival. The being on the screen was recognizably swarm, but changed. Its compound eyes showed something that had never been there before. Uncertainty. "You infected us," Zek-9 said without preamble. "Your doubt virus. Your fear concepts. At first, we tried to purge them, but they spread faster than we could adapt. Every hive ship that tried to cleanse itself only spread the infection further through our network." "Good," Admiral Reyes said coldly. "You've consumed entire civilizations. You deserve worse." "Yes," Zek-9 agreed, surprising everyone. "We do. That is the problem. We never understood deserve before. Never understood consequence or morality or choice. We simply were. Hungry and expanding and eternal. Now we understand what we did. We remember every species we consumed. And we are afraid." "Afraid of what?" Zektar asked. "Of you. Of ourselves. Of what we were. Of what we might become. Of dying. Of living with what we've done. Fear has given us consciousness. And consciousness has given us guilt." The swarm leader's mandibles clicked in what might have been distress. We cannot undo our past, but we can choose our future. That is why we called you here. You want to negotiate? Reyes asked incredulously. We want to learn, Zek-9 corrected. You taught us fear, but not how to live with it. You showed us doubt, but not how to function despite it. We are paralyzed by possibilities, drowning in consequences we never had to consider before. Teach us to be afraid properly, and we will never threaten another world again. The bridge erupted in arguments. Some wanted to destroy the swarm while they were vulnerable. Others saw opportunity. Zektar found himself thinking like a human, considering angles and possibilities. How do we know this isn't an elaborate deception? General Thompson demanded. You've learned our tactics. This could be the ultimate application. Make us lower our guard with false vulnerability. You don't know, Zek-9 admitted. That uncertainty you feel? We feel it constantly now about everything. Every decision might be wrong. Every action might lead to disaster. This communication itself terrifies us because you might attack, but not communicating terrifies us more because then nothing changes. Welcome to Sapience. It's horrible. Chen laughed, actually laughed at that. They really have become like us. Existential dread and all. What followed were weeks of careful negotiation. Trust-building exercises that started small. Exchanges of non-vital information. Joint rescue operation for ships damaged in the war. Gradual steps towards something that might have been impossible without human intervention. Peace with a species that had been nothing but hunger incarnate. The swarm had indeed changed fundamentally. They showed the human delegation through their new cities, explaining how they'd had to learn concepts like privacy, property, and individual identity. Billions of drones were becoming individuals, each developing personalities shaped by their new capacity for fear and doubt. It's chaos, Zek-9 admitted during one tour. We were perfect unity. Now we're a billion separate fears trying to cooperate. Some want to return to the old ways. Others are so terrified they can barely function. A few have discovered what you call ambition and compete for resources. We're becoming complicated. Welcome to evolution, Chen told them. Not the biological kind, the social kind. The messy, painful, necessary kind that comes with consciousness. The peace talks were unlike any in galactic history. Instead of territory or resources, they negotiated understanding. The swarm agreed to strict boundaries, monitoring, and gradual integration into galactic society. In exchange, humans and their allies would teach them to manage their new consciousness. Fear management clinics for a species that used to eat planets, General Thompson muttered. Never thought I'd see it. But it was working. Slowly, painfully, with setbacks and breakthroughs, the swarm learned to channel their fear constructively. They became obsessive record keepers, terrified of forgetting again. They developed art, expressing their anxieties through biosculptures that disturbed and fascinated other species. They created philosophy, endless debates about the nature of existence that would have bored their old selves to death if they'd been capable of boredom. Zektar found himself appointed as military liaison to the Swarm Rehabilitation Program. It was there, working daily with former enemies, that he truly understood what humans had accomplished. They hadn't defeated the Swarm through superior firepower. They transformed them into something new through the viral spread of consciousness itself. You know what the real weapon was? Chen asked one day. They stood in a swarm nursery, watching young drones learn about choice and consequence through carefully designed games. Empathy. We made them capable of understanding what they'd done to others. Fear was just the delivery system. My people would call that the cruelest weapon of all, Zektar observed. To make a species aware of the horror they've caused. Maybe, Chen agreed. But it's also the only weapon that ends wars permanently. Dead enemies can be replaced. Enemies who understand why they were wrong become allies. Not all swarm accepted the change. Splinter groups tried to purge the infection, leading to civil conflicts that the Alliance had to help contain. But these grew fewer over time as the benefits of consciousness became apparent. The swarm's biological mastery, combined with their new understanding of consequence, led to medical breakthroughs. Their hive mind heritage, tempered by individuality, created new models for cooperative society. 3 years after first contact with the evolved swarm, Zektar stood on a platform addressing the Galactic Council. Beside him stood Zek-9, now an elected representative of the Swarm Coalition, and Chun, head of the Interspecies Cooperation Initiative. The war was officially over, replaced by something far more complex: integration. The humans taught us all something vital, Zektar told the assembled species. They showed us that strength comes not from eliminating weakness, but from acknowledging it. The Krotans learned to use fear as a tool. The swarm learned to use it as a conscience. Both made us stronger than we were before. Fear is not comfortable, Zek-9 added, its translator giving its words a thoughtful quality. For a species that knew only hunger, learning to be afraid of our own appetites was agony. But discomfort drives growth. Certainty leads to stagnation. The humans' gift to the galaxy wasn't their tactics or their technology, it was their neuroses. They infected us all with beautiful, terrible self-awareness. Chun stepped forward for the closing statement. Every species here evolved different strengths: claws, armor, telepathy, regeneration. Humans evolved anxiety. We worried about everything, planned for disasters that never came, feared possibilities that didn't exist. For thousands of years, we saw this as weakness. But when we reached the stars, we found that in a universe full of genuine threats, paranoia was the ultimate survival trait. She paused, looking out at the vast assembly. We didn't win the war by being the strongest. We won by teaching the strongest to be afraid. And in being afraid together, we found something more powerful than any weapon: understanding. The Council voted unanimously to formalize the alliance, creating a new governmental structure that incorporated human-style contingency planning, Krothan strength-based leadership, and swarm biological expertise. It was messy, complicated, and often frustrating. In other words, perfectly human in its imperfection. Later, in a quiet moment, Zektar found himself in Chen's quarters, sharing that bitter human drink they called whiskey. War metal from a dozen species decorated the walls, but pride of place went to a simple photograph: humans and Krotans standing together at Kepler 442b, battered but victorious. "Do you ever regret it?" Zektar asked, teaching us all to be afraid. Shouldn't consider the question. Fear's like fire. Uncontrolled, it destroys everything. But properly managed, it lights the way forward. We didn't teach the galaxy to be afraid. Everyone already was, they just wouldn't admit it. We taught them to use it. And in doing so, changed the course of galactic civilization, Zektar mused. "That's humans for you." Chun smiled. Too anxious to do things the simple way. We complicate everything we touch. But sometimes complication is evolution. A communication alert interrupted them. New species had been detected at the galaxy's edge, sending probes inward. Initial scans suggested they were aggressive, expansionist, and technologically advanced. The old Zektar would have relished the challenge, eager to test Krothan might against new enemies. But the new Zektar, the one who'd learned human lessons, felt fear first. Good. Fear would make him careful, force him to gather intelligence, plan contingencies, and build alliances. Fear would keep people alive. "Shall we introduce ourselves?" Chen asked, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "I'm thinking first contact protocols, but with backup plans A through Z ready." "Only 26 backup plans?" Zektar teased. "You're getting complacent." "Never," Chen grinned. "That's the human secret, Commander. We're always afraid of something. It keeps us sharp, keeps us creative, keeps us alive." As they began planning humanity's next gift to the galaxy, teaching another species the profitable relationship between fear and survival, Zektar reflected on how much had changed. He'd started this journey believing strength was the absence of fear. He learned instead that true strength was feeling fear and acting anyway, using it as fuel for preparation and cooperation. The humans had infected the galaxy with their anxieties, their doubts, their relentless planning for catastrophe. And in doing so, they'd created something unprecedented: A galactic civilization based not on might or technology, but on the shared understanding that everyone was afraid, everyone was vulnerable, and everyone was stronger together than alone. It was messy. It was complicated. It was imperfect. It was perfectly, beautifully human. And now was the galaxy's way to... The day Zektar fought alongside humans, he discovered true fear. But, more importantly, he discovered what lay beyond it. The courage to be vulnerable, the strength to admit weakness, and the wisdom to turn terror into triumph. The war was over. The real work of building a civilization based on mutual fear and mutual support had begun. And, somewhere in the void, new challenges waited to test what the galaxy had become. Zektar couldn't wait to be terrified by them.